Your hands, that was wrong. And after that, the rancher faced something terrifying. The first rays of the morning sun stretched over the wide, empty fields, casting long shadows on the rough earth. The ranch was quiet, except for the soft rustle of leaves in the wind and the occasional low call of a distant bird. The rancher, a man in his early 50s with sun-weathered skin and strong, calloused hands, moved carefully between the pens, checking on the animals as he had done every morning for decades. Each step he took was familiar, almost automatic, but today there was a tension in his movements, a small impatience hidden beneath his steady exterior. He paused at the fence where a few of the younger horses were kept. One of them, a chestnut colt, was restless, pawing at the ground and tossing its head nervously. The rancher knew the colt was not used to visitors. He reached out with his hand to soothe it, speaking softly in a low, calm voice. Easy now. Calm down. The colt whinnied and stepped back slightly, sensing his presence but unsure of the touch. From the corner of the yard, a young man watched quietly. He was new to the ranch, sent to help for the season, and he admired the rancher's skill and experience. There was a quiet confidence in the way the older man worked. Every motion was precise, every glance calculated. But today, the young man noticed something different. The rancher's hand shook slightly as he reached to adjust a halter, and he fumbled with a rope for longer than usual. "But you've done this 100 times," the young man said, stepping closer.
Why does it look so difficult today? The rancher gave a small shrug, brushing off the question with a half smile.
"Bear. Just one of those mornings. Nothing more." But even as he said it, his eyes flicked to the colt's tense muscles and the nervous flick of its ears. He knew that animals could sense fear or hesitation, and he hated to show weakness in front of them. He tried to tie the halter properly, but his hand missed the knot and the rope slipped from his grasp. The colt jerked back suddenly, startled. The rancher reacted instinctively, grabbing it too hard in a moment of frustration. The animal squealed softly, backing away, and for a moment the rancher's heart sank. He had never hurt an animal intentionally, not in his life. His hands were strong, yes, but they were meant for care, not harm. The young man stepped closer, his eyes wide with concern. "Your hands, that was wrong," he said quietly, his voice trembling with worry. But, die!" The words hung in the air like a cold shadow, and for the first time the rancher paused. He looked at his own hands, scarred and roughened by years of labor, and felt an unusual discomfort. It was not pain that made him pause, but a sudden awareness that he had acted without thought, and that this one moment could carry consequences he did not yet understand. The rancher straightened up, shaking his head as if to clear it. I didn't mean to," he muttered more to himself than to the young man. The colt snorted, uneasy but unharmed, and stepped back into the pen. The rancher exhaled, running his hands over his face, feeling the sting of guilt more than anything else. He had always prided himself on being careful, on knowing each animal's moods and needs, and yet in one small moment he had acted too quickly, too harshly. The young man remained quiet, watching the rancher closely. "Pay." He did not say another word, but the worry in his eyes spoke volumes. He had seen the way the rancher treated the animals, with patience, care, and respect, and this sudden lapse seemed out of place, almost like a warning. The rancher walked slowly back to the main barn, checking each pen along the way. The chickens were clucking and pecking at the ground, the cows were grazing lazily, and the horses had settled down. Everything seemed normal again, but he could not shake the uneasy feeling in his chest. It was as though the land itself had noticed his mistake, and it was waiting to remind him that every action had a consequence.
By mid-morning, the rancher had moved on to other chores.
He repaired a broken fence post, filled water troughs, and inspected the barn for any signs of trouble. Each task required careful attention, and he focused on them with the precision of a man used to solitude and responsibility. But despite the routine, a tension lingered beneath the surface. The memory of the colt's sudden fright and the young man's warning echoed in his mind. "Your hands. That was wrong." The words repeated themselves, a soft but unrelenting reminder of a momentary lapse.
Around noon, the young man approached again, carrying a bucket of feed for the animals.
But he set it down near the pen and looked at the rancher with a mixture of concern and hesitation. Do you want me to help with the horses?" he asked. The rancher shook his head. "No, I've got it. Just keep an eye on the younger ones. Make sure they don't wander." He tried to sound normal, but even he could hear the tightness in his own voice. But the rancher prided himself on handling things alone, on being capable, but today he felt a fragile sense of doubt creeping in. He moved to the horse pens again, checking each animal carefully. The colt had calmed down, its breathing even, but it still glanced at him with wary eyes. The rancher crouched down and held out his hand, letting the animal sniff it before he gently stroked its neck. "It's all right," he murmured. "I'm not going to hurt you again." He felt a small sense of relief as the colt relaxed slightly, but the warning from the young man lingered in his mind. The rest of the day passed with routine tasks. The rancher mended fences, carried hay, and repaired equipment. Each chore required focus, but even in the busyness of work, he could not shake the uneasy feeling. Something had shifted, small but significant, and he knew it was connected to the earlier mistake. Every now and then he caught the young man glancing at him, silent but questioning. It was a quiet reminder that he was not entirely alone, that someone else had witnessed his lapse. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the fields in shades of gold and orange, the rancher paused to rest. He leaned against a fence post, wiping sweat from his forehead with a rough sleeve. The animals had settled for the evening, the barn doors were secured, and the land was quiet again. But he could not shake the feeling that something was waiting, something he could not see, but could sense in the air, in the shifting shadows and the rustle of leaves. He thought about the words again. "Your hands, that was wrong." At first he had felt defensive, as if the young man had accused him unfairly. But now, in the quiet of the evening, the rancher could not deny the truth in those words. For a brief moment he had acted without care, and even though no serious harm had come of it, he felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him.
As darkness fell, the rancher finished his evening rounds.
Bay. He fed the animals, checked the fences one last time, and closed the barn doors. The stars began to appear in the sky, scattered across the vast expanse like tiny points of light in the darkness. The rancher stood for a moment, looking up at them, feeling a quiet sense of both peace and unease. The day had been long and tiring, but it had also been a reminder, a warning that every action mattered, no matter how small. Finally, he walked back to his modest home on the ranch. Inside, the room was simple and functional, with a wooden table, a small stove, and a few chairs. He sat down heavily, feeling the soreness in his muscles, and poured himself a cup of strong coffee. He stared into the cup, lost in thought, replaying the events of the morning over and over. The colt, the rope, the sudden jerk of his hands, and the young man's voice, all of it formed a pattern he could not ignore. Outside, the wind picked up slightly, rustling the leaves and carrying a chill through the open windows. The rancher shivered and pulled his jacket tighter around him. He could not explain why, but the feeling of unease lingered, settling into the corners of his mind like a shadow he could not shake. The day had ended, but the warning remained. Something had shifted, small but undeniable, and he knew, without fully understanding why, that the events of this morning were only the beginning. As he sat in silence, the rancher made a quiet promise to himself.
He would be more careful. He would pay attention to every motion, every choice, every action he took.
He could not undo what had happened, but he could ensure that it did not happen again. And yet, despite the determination in his heart, he could not rid himself of the subtle fear that lingered at the edge of his thoughts, a whisper of something unseen, waiting for the next moment of carelessness. The rancher went to bed that night, exhausted but unable to sleep easily. His mind replayed the day, the colt's frightened eyes, the rope slipping from his hands, and the young man's warning. He tossed and turned, feeling a restless tension in his chest. For the first time in years, he felt vulnerable, uncertain, as though the careful routine of his life had been disturbed by one small misstep. And outside in the darkness, the ranch remained quiet. Too quiet. The wind sighed through the trees, carrying with it a sense of anticipation, as if the land itself knew that something had changed. The rancher closed his eyes, trying to will the fear away, but deep down he knew that the day's mistake, small though it may have seemed, had set something in motion, and that tomorrow he would have to face the consequences in ways he could not yet imagine. The morning came again, pale and quiet, but the ranch felt different. The air seemed heavier, and even the birds were unusually silent. The rancher rose from his bed with a lingering unease. He had slept poorly, tossing and turning, unable to escape the memory of yesterday's mistake. "Your hands, that was wrong," the young man's words echoed again, louder this time in the stillness of the room. He dressed slowly, pulling on worn clothes that had been with him for years, each one carrying the scent of dust, hay, and sweat. He felt the weight of his own hands, staring at them as if they had betrayed him somehow. The rough skin, the scars, the calluses. They had always been his tools, his means of care. But yesterday, for a fleeting moment, they had been careless, and the thought clung to him like a shadow. Outside, the ranch spread wide under a pale sky. The animals moved quietly, almost unusually calm. The rancher noticed the colt from yesterday standing stiffly near the fence, its ears flicking toward him with caution. He approached slowly, speaking in the soft, steady voice he had always used. "It's all right, little one. I'm here." The colt whinnied softly, but its eyes were wary, and it took a step back. The rancher paused. Something about the way the young animal watched him unsettled him. It was as though it remembered yesterday too vividly. He moved on to the cows, inspecting them carefully. Everything seemed normal, yet a nagging tension lingered. Tools, he had set in their usual places, seemed slightly out of order, though he had not touched them. He chalked it up to his own forgetfulness, yet a small seed of doubt planted itself in his mind. Perhaps yesterday's mistake had unsettled more than just the colt. Perhaps it had disturbed something he could not see. The young man appeared again, carrying a small bucket of water. "Morning," he said softly. "Careful not to startle the rancher." He placed the bucket down near the horses. "I thought I'd check on the pens first." The rancher nodded, trying to sound normal, but his voice carried the tightness of concern. "Good idea. Make sure everything is in order." He paused, then added quietly, almost to himself, "And keep an eye on the colt, Bess. He's still a bit nervous." The young man hesitated, then glanced at him. Do you think it's because of yesterday?" he asked cautiously. "Bet." The rancher's jaw tightened. "Maybe." "Or maybe he's just being a young horse. That's all." But deep down he knew the young man was right. Something had shifted. Bet one careless moment had left a mark, not just on the colt, but perhaps on the ranch itself. He tried to push the thought away, focusing on the chores that needed to be done. As the day moved on, subtle changes began to appear. Livestock wandered slightly off their usual paths, looking toward the woods, as if sensing something beyond the fence line. A cow gave a low, uneasy moo for no apparent reason, and the horses seemed jumpy, twitching at noises that were too faint for the human ear. Tools were misplaced, as though moved by unseen hands, and a strange chill lingered in certain corners of the barn. The rancher felt his heart tighten each time he noticed these things. Yet he tried to ignore them, convincing himself that it was only his imagination.
By late morning, the wind picked up, carrying a low whistle through the trees.
The rancher stopped what he was doing, listening carefully. There was a rhythm to the sound that seemed deliberate, almost like a warning. He shook his head, trying to dismiss it.
It's just the wind, he muttered aloud.
Vast, yet even as he said it, a shiver ran down his spine. The land felt different. Quieter in some ways, too still in others, as if it were waiting for something. The young man approached again, his face pale. "Did you hear that?" he asked softly, pointing toward the edge of the woods. The rancher glanced in the direction he indicated. At first he saw nothing unusual. Then, from the corner of his eye, he thought he caught a glimpse of movement, a shadow slipping between the trees. He frowned and shook his head. "Probably just an animal," he said, though the uncertainty in his voice betrayed him. The rest of the day seemed to stretch longer than usual. The rancher moved from task to task, checking fences, feeding animals, and repairing equipment, but each action carried a sense of urgency he had not felt before. It was as though the ranch itself was holding its breath, watching him, waiting for another mistake. The young man stayed close, observing silently, occasionally glancing toward the shadowy edges of the property. His caution only heightened the rancher's own unease. As afternoon fell, the first signs of real trouble appeared. A cow wandered dangerously close to the edge of the pasture, her eyes wide with fear. The rancher ran to her, waving his arms and shouting, trying to guide her back safely. But no matter how he moved, she seemed to resist, drawn by something unseen. When he finally corralled her, he noticed deep scratches along her flank. He frowned. The fence was intact. Nothing had fallen on her. He knelt, running his fingers over the marks, a creeping dread settling in his chest. Bear. Something had been in the pasture, something he could not see. The young man approached again, this time with urgency.
We should check the barn.
I think something is moving inside. The rancher nodded, trying to hide the fear creeping into his voice. They moved carefully toward the barn, every step measured. As they neared it, a soft rustling sound echoed from within. The rancher's heart pounded, and he gripped the door handle tightly. Slowly, he pulled it open. Despair.
Nothing.
The barn was empty, the animals all in their usual stalls. Yet the feeling of being watched did not fade. Tools were scattered, though he had placed them neatly the day before. Feed bags had been shifted, and a small pile of hay that had been stacked perfectly now lay scattered across the floor. The rancher's stomach sank. He had checked everything carefully that morning. No human could have done this. "We're not imagining it," the young man whispered, his voice tight. "Something's here." The rancher nodded slowly, feeling a chill run down his spine. He had always believed in practical explanations, in the certainty of hard work and routine. But today, logic seemed to falter. Something beyond understanding had entered his life, creeping quietly, testing him. By evening, the tension had grown unbearable. Shadows stretched long across the ranch as the sun dipped below the horizon. The wind carried strange noises, low whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. The rancher moved cautiously among the animals, checking each one, speaking softly to calm them. Yet even the familiar sounds of the animals did little to ease his mind. The young man stayed close, his eyes darting to every shadow. Bah. Maybe it's the colt, he said hesitantly. Maybe he sensed something wrong yesterday, and now... His voice trailed off. The rancher understood without words. The colt's nervousness had been the first warning, the first sign that something had shifted in the balance of the ranch. And now, that warning had grown into something larger, something he could not ignore. As darkness fell completely, the rancher made one last check of the perimeter. Fences were intact, gates locked, and animals secure, yet the feeling of being watched did not fade. He stood in the middle of the pasture looking toward the darkened woods, listening to the wind sigh through the trees. He felt a presence, not hostile, but insistent, like a silent observer waiting for him to slip again. The young man came up beside him, voice barely audible. "Do you feel it?" The rancher nodded slowly. Bay. "I've felt it since this morning. And I think it's because of yesterday. That moment. That mistake. It set something in motion." They stood in silence, the ranch stretching wide around them, the animals settled but uneasy. The rancher felt the weight of responsibility pressing down more heavily than ever. One wrong move, one careless action, and the balance of their world could be disrupted. Bleh. He thought of the colt's frightened eyes, the scratches on the cow, the scattered tools in the barn. All small signs, but together they formed a warning he could not ignore. Night deepened, and the stars blinked coldly overhead. The rancher and the young man returned to the house, each step deliberate, every shadow on the ground making them pause. Inside, the rancher lit a small lamp, the warm glow filling the room but failing to push back the cold tension that had settled over him. He poured a cup of coffee, but the usual comfort it brought was gone. The sense of unease was stronger than exhaustion or warmth. He stared into the dark liquid, thinking about the events of the day.
It had begun as a small, simple mistake, a moment of carelessness with a young animal, but it grown into something more, something he could feel but not name.
He did not know if it was punishment, consequence, or simply the natural order of the land asserting itself, but he knew one thing. He could not ignore it. Outside, the wind moaned through the trees, carrying with it the faint scent of something untamed. The rancher shivered and pulled his jacket tighter around him. He sat quietly, thinking, planning, and watching. Tomorrow would come, and with it, he knew he would face more signs, more warnings. He could not yet see what lay ahead, but he felt the presence of something waiting. Patient, silent, and inevitable. And in that quiet, the rancher made a vow to himself. He would be careful. He would not allow another careless moment to upset the balance of the ranch. But even as he made that promise, a small, stubborn fear lingered. Something had been awakened yesterday, and no matter how careful he became, it would not be easy to put it back to rest. Pay. Night had fallen fully over the ranch. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a pale silver light over the wide fields and the dense patches of trees that bordered the property. A quiet wind whispered through the branches, carrying with it a faint chill that made the rancher pull his jacket tighter around his shoulders. He had spent the evening double-checking every fence, every gate, and every stall, but a lingering unease gnawed at him. The events of the previous day and the subtle signs that had followed were no longer just small disturbances. They had grown into something more, something he could feel watching him. He stepped outside again, careful not to make a sound. The young man followed closely behind, holding a lantern that cast flickering shadows on the ground. The rancher's heart beat faster with every step, not from fear alone, but from the sense that the land itself had changed. Even the animals, secure in their pens, were restless. The colt from yesterday pawed at the ground nervously, and the horses in the distance shifted, ears twitching toward invisible movements. The rancher stopped near the edge of the barn, listening carefully. The wind sighed through the roof and the old wooden walls, but beneath the natural sounds he could hear something else, a faint rustling, a whisper of movement that seemed deliberate. He glanced at the young man who was watching him with wide eyes. "Did you hear that?" the young man whispered. "Yes," the rancher said quietly, trying to steady his own voice. "Bay, something is out there." They moved closer to the barn, lanterns swinging gently to illuminate the familiar surroundings. As they approached, a shadow flickered at the far end of the structure. The rancher froze, every muscle in his body tensing. The shadow moved again, faster this time, darting between the posts and disappearing behind a stack of hay. The young man swallowed hard. I think it's inside," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The rancher nodded, feeling a surge of fear mixed with determination. He had always faced challenges on the ranch: broken fences, sick animals, storms that tore through the land. But this was different. This was unseen, unpredictable, and something about it felt almost aware, almost intelligent. He pushed open the barn door slowly, the creak of the hinges sounding unusually loud in the stillness. The lantern's light danced across the walls, illuminating the familiar shapes of hay bales, tools, and the animals in their stalls. Everything seemed in order, yet the sense of presence remained, pressing against him like a heavy weight. Suddenly, a soft thud echoed from the far corner. The rancher's heart leapt. He took a step forward, lantern held high, and saw movement, a shadow darting between the posts again. The colt whinnied nervously, stepping back into its stall. Spare. The rancher exhaled slowly, forcing himself to remain calm. He could not allow panic to take over. "Stay close," he whispered to the young man. "Whatever this is, we need to face it together." They moved carefully through the barn, checking each stall, each corner. Nothing visible appeared, yet the sound of movement continued, soft and deliberate. Tools were slightly shifted from where they had been placed earlier, and hay that had been stacked neatly now lay scattered across the floor. The rancher's mind raced. Nothing in the barn should have been disturbed. And yet, it had been. He felt the old fear creeping in, the same sense of helplessness that had haunted him since the colt incident. A sudden gust of wind blew through the open barn doors, extinguishing the lantern for a moment. Darkness enveloped them, and the rancher felt the presence closer than ever. He reached out instinctively, gripping the young man's shoulder. "Stay calm," he said firmly, more to reassure himself than anyone else. When the light returned, he saw it, a shadow, moving too quickly to be human, darting near the far wall. It paused for a moment, as if studying them, then vanished again. The rancher's pulse quickened. This was no ordinary animal, no natural occurrence. Something had been awakened, something that had been disturbed by his earlier carelessness. Bet. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his hands. "It doesn't want to hurt us, not yet," he said quietly. "It's testing us." The young man looked at him, eyes wide. "Testing us? What do you mean?" The rancher shook his head slowly. "I don't know, but whatever it is, it's aware. It knows we're here. And it's patient. We have to be careful, or it will act. Bound. They continued their careful search, moving methodically through the barn. Each corner revealed nothing, yet the sense of presence never faded. Shadows seemed to flicker in the corners of their eyes, movement too quick to capture. The animals reacted subtly. A horse shivered. A cow lowed softly. The colt backed further into its stall. Brace. All signs pointed to one truth. The rancher's mistake yesterday had set something in motion, and now it was watching, learning, waiting. Hours passed, or perhaps it was only minutes. Time seemed distorted in the darkness. The rancher's senses were heightened, every sound amplified, every shadow a potential threat. He felt a growing sense of responsibility. This was not just about him anymore. The ranch, the animals, even the young man's safety rested in his hands. One wrong move, one moment of fear, could allow the unseen presence to gain the upper hand. Then, as if in answer to his thoughts, a sudden noise erupted from the corner of the barn. A loud thump, followed by the sound of something dragging across the floor. The rancher spun toward it, lantern held high, and saw the shadow again. This time, it was clearer, more defined, moving with intent. It paused, then darted toward the open door, vanishing into the night. The rancher's chest heaved, adrenaline pumping through him. Pshh! It's leaving, for now, he said, but it will come back. The young man looked at him, fear etched on his face. How do we stop it? He asked. The rancher shook his head.
I don't think we can stop it.
We can only be ready. We have to watch, and we have to act carefully. One wrong move, and it could be worse. The rest of the night was spent in tense vigilance. The rancher patrolled the perimeter, checking fences, gates, and animal pens with meticulous care. Every sound made him pause, every shadow caused his heart to race. Yet, despite the fear, he felt a strange clarity. He understood now that his earlier mistake, the rough handling of the colt, had consequences far beyond what he could have imagined. He had disturbed a balance, and now he had to restore it. As the hours passed, subtle signs continued. The animals were restless, more so than before. Tools and equipment appeared slightly shifted. Hay was disturbed, and the wind carried faint whispers that made the hair on the rancher's arms stand on end. Each sign reminded him of the lesson he had ignored. Every action mattered, no matter how small. By the early hours of the morning, exhaustion threatened to overcome him, but he could not afford to rest. The young man leaned against the barn wall, shivering, but the rancher kept a steady watch. They had survived the immediate threat, but the presence had not been defeated. It was patient, watching, learning, and waiting for another moment of weakness. Finally, as the first hint of dawn colored the sky in soft shades of pink and gold, the movement ceased. The shadows receded, and the wind grew still. The rancher allowed himself a small sigh of relief, though the tension remained. He knew the presence had not vanished, only retreated for the moment. It would return, testing him again, probing for weakness. The young man glanced at him, voice shaky. Do you think it's gone? The rancher shook his head slowly. God, not gone, just waiting. But we learned something tonight. We know it's here. We know it watches. And now, we can prepare. They moved back into the house, each step careful and deliberate. Inside, the rancher poured a cup of coffee, the warmth and scent grounding him after the tense night. He thought about the events, the signs, the restless animals, and the shadow that had moved with intent in the barn. It had been terrifying, yes, but it had also revealed a truth he could not ignore. The ranch, The land and the animals were all part of a delicate balance, one that he had disrupted by a moment of carelessness. He sat at the wooden table, staring at the cup in his hands. The young man joined him, voice quiet.
Do you think it will come back tonight?
The rancher nodded.
It will, but now we are ready.
We will not make the same mistake again. We will be careful, and we will watch. Breaths. Even as he spoke, a chill lingered in the room. The memory of the shadow, the sound of movement in the dark, and the restless animals reminded him that the presence was patient, clever, and observant. He could not see it, could not predict its actions, but he knew it would return, and he would have to face it fully. Outside, the ranch lay quiet under the rising sun. The events of the night were over, but the tension remained. The rancher understood now that he could not ignore the consequences of even small actions, that responsibility extended beyond human understanding, and that vigilance was the only protection against the unseen. He had faced fear directly, learned from it, and survived. But the experience had changed him, and he knew that the days to come would test him in ways he had never imagined. The next morning dawned with a soft gray light, spilling across the fields and painting the ranch in muted colors. The wind had calmed, but the air still felt heavy, as though carrying the memory of the night before. The rancher rose from his bed with a mixture of fatigue and determination. The events of yesterday and last night had left him restless, but they had also sharpened his mind. He knew that he could not afford to be careless again. Every step, every action, every movement would matter today. He dressed slowly, pulling on his worn jacket and sturdy boots. The young man had already begun his morning chores, carrying water to the animals and preparing feed. He glanced at the rancher with quiet concern. "Do you think it will come back?" he asked, his voice low. The rancher nodded, though he tried to make his expression calm. "It will, but we are ready this time. We will not make the same mistakes. We will watch, and we will act carefully." Psst. The rancher stepped outside and took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the crisp morning air. The fields stretched wide, familiar and yet different, as though the land itself had been changed by the events of the night. The animals were restless but calm, their movements cautious. The colt from the first day lingered near the fence, ears flicking toward every small sound, as if remembering the fear from before. The rancher approached slowly, speaking softly.
It's all right. That's our.
I'm here. "You're safe," becked. The colt whinnied softly and allowed him to stroke its neck. The small trust restored was a relief, but the rancher knew the balance was still delicate. They began their day as usual, checking fences, feeding the animals, and inspecting the barn. Each task was done with care and attention, every movement deliberate. The rancher's mind was alert, scanning for anything unusual. Shadows, noises, even the slightest movement of the animals drew his focus. He moved slowly, deliberately, aware of every detail, as though the ranch itself were alive and watching him in return. Around midday, the first sign of the presence returned. A soft rustling came from the far edge of the property, near the woods. The rancher froze, listening carefully. The young man looked to him, eyes wide with apprehension. "Is it back?" he whispered. The rancher nodded slowly. "Yes. But this time we know it's here. We can face it." He stepped forward cautiously, moving toward the source of the sound. The wind shifted, carrying a strange, faint whisper through the air. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it made the hair on the rancher's arms stand on end. He could feel the presence watching, assessing, waiting. The shadow appeared again, just beyond the trees.
It moved quickly, a dark flicker that was more felt than seen.
The rancher took a slow, deliberate step forward. "We face it together," he said to the young man, who nodded and stayed close. Every movement they made was careful, controlled, measured.
The rancher had learned from the previous night that fear could be dangerous, that panic would only give the unseen presence power.
They approached the edge of the woods, the animals nearby quiet and tense. The rustling grew louder, more deliberate, as though the presence was testing their patience, gauging their reaction. The rancher stopped and took a deep breath, centering himself. He spoke softly, as if trying to communicate with whatever watched them.
"I understand now. I was careless.
I will not make that mistake again." For a long moment, nothing moved. Bah. The wind stilled, the animals quieted, and the air seemed to hold its breath. Then, slowly, the shadow receded, moving back into the trees, disappearing as mysteriously as it had appeared. The rancher exhaled slowly, feeling a cautious relief. The presence had returned, yes, but it had also recognized his attention and care. He had faced it with patience, with respect, and that seemed to matter. The rest of the day was spent with careful observation. The rancher and the young man moved through the property slowly, checking fences, inspecting the barns, and watching the animals. Nothing unusual happened, but the tension remained, a quiet reminder that the balance was still delicate. Bang. Each time the rancher looked at his hands, he felt the weight of responsibility. They were not just tools, they were instruments of care, and he had to use them wisely. By late afternoon, the rancher felt a strange calm settle over him. The immediate threat had passed, and yet he knew that vigilance was still necessary. He had learned something important. The world was full of forces beyond understanding, and even small mistakes could have unexpected consequences. The ranch, the animals, and even the land itself were part of a larger balance, one that demanded respect and attention. The young man approached, carrying a small bucket of feed. "Bast.
Do you think it's gone for good?"
he asked. The rancher shook his head slowly, though a faint smile touched his lips. "Not gone. Just be patient. It knows we understand now."
That's enough for today, but we must always remember respect, care, attention.
That is what keeps everything in balance.
Even as he spoke, the rancher felt a quiet gratitude.
For the events of the past days had been terrifying, yes, but they had also taught him something invaluable. He had learned to see the ranch, the animals, and the land with new eyes. Every moment mattered, every action had a consequence, and responsibility was more than a simple word. It was a way of living. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, the rancher and the young man returned to the house. The animals were calm, the barn secure, and the land seemed peaceful once more. The rancher prepared a simple dinner, the quiet satisfaction of routine grounding him after the tension of the past days. The young man ate quietly, still thoughtful, clearly impressed by the rancher's steady control and calm in the face of fear. After dinner, they sat outside on the porch, looking out over the fields. Breath. The air was cool, the stars beginning to appear in the sky. The rancher felt a quiet pride, not in conquest or bravado, but in understanding, patience, and care.
He had faced fear directly, had confronted the unknown, and had learned the importance of vigilance and respect. The young man broke the silence.
"I've never seen anyone handle something like that," he said quietly. "Most people would have panicked, or run. You faced it. The rancher nodded. Fear is natural, but panic is dangerous. We cannot control everything, but we can control how we respond. That is what matters. They sat in silence for a while, watching the stars and listening to the quiet sounds of the ranch. The animals moved softly in the pens, the wind whispered through the trees, and the world seemed to hold its breath. The rancher knew that the presence, whatever it truly was still out there, watching, patient, and waiting. But he also knew that he had changed. He would be ready when it returned. As the night deepened, the rancher finally went to bed, feeling a calm exhaustion. His hands, rough and scarred, felt steady and capable once more. Desk. He had learned the weight of responsibility, the importance of care, and the consequences of even small mistakes. The ranch, the animals, and the land had all been part of a lesson he would never forget. The young man slept nearby, comforted by the rancher's steady presence and the knowledge that he was in capable hands. Outside, the night remained quiet, but the rancher knew that he would remain vigilant, always ready, always attentive. When the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, the rancher rose with a renewed sense of purpose. The land looked peaceful, the animals calm, but he knew the balance required constant attention. He moved through the ranch with care, checking fences, inspecting barns, and speaking softly to the animals. Each movement was deliberate, each action thoughtful. The memory of the shadow, the rustling, and the presence remained, a quiet reminder of the lessons learned. By midday, the rancher allowed himself a small moment of reflection. Patient, he stood at the edge of the field, looking out over the wide expanse of his land. The wind carried the faint scent of earth and hay, and the animals moved quietly in the distance. He felt a sense of gratitude, not for the fear or the danger, but for the understanding it had brought. He had faced something terrifying, yes, but he had survived, learned, and grown wiser. The young man approached, carrying water for the animals. "Do you think it will ever return?" he asked. The rancher smiled faintly. "Perhaps. But now we understand it better. We know to act carefully, to respect the balance. That is all we can do. Fear is not to be denied, but it is not to control us either." They spent the rest of the day tending the ranch with calm, deliberate attention. The animals moved more easily, sensing the rancher's steady presence. Tools were organized, fences secure, and the land seemed to breathe a little easier under the careful watch of the man who had learned to respect it fully. As evening fell, the rancher stood on the porch, looking out at the quiet fields, bent. The events of the past days lingered in his mind, but they no longer weighed heavily. They had taught him responsibility, patience, and vigilance. Beside, they had shown him that even small mistakes could have consequences, but that careful action, understanding, and attention could restore balance. The young man joined him, speaking softly.
"I've learned a lot from watching you. I hope I can be as careful and thoughtful as you." The rancher nodded, placing a hand on the young man's shoulder.
"Bay, you will. Just remember, every action matters, every choice matters. Respect the land, the animals, and the work you do. That is what keeps balance." Bay. Night fell, calm and quiet this time. The rancher went to bed with a sense of peace he had not felt in days. The presence that had haunted them had not disappeared, but it had been acknowledged and understood. The balance had been restored, at least for now. But as the rancher drifted into sleep, he knew that he would carry the lessons with him always. The weight of responsibility, the importance of care, and the vigilance required to face the unknown. The ranch, the animals, and the land were safe, but only because he had learned to respect them fully.